Okay. Oh. Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to the 84th meeting of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. Today is the second of two hearings on the human rights situation in Somalia. These meetings were initiated in response to the horrific October 14th truck bombing in Mogadishu that claimed the lives of 358 people and the October 28 bombing that claimed 27 lives perpetrated by the terrorist group Al-Shabaab. As we heard yesterday, the Somali people have endured awful violations of their fundamental rights and freedoms and a perpetual state of insecurity, including famine. With the 2016 election and the international community's re-engagement, there has been a sense of hope for a more peaceful future in Somalia, but the situation remains extremely precarious. It's in this context that the Subcommittee on International Human Rights is holding these hearings. Before us today are three witnesses. Fawzia Abdul-Qadir is the founding member of Ogaden Human Rights Committee of Canada and has researched transnational justice and the role of customary law in Somalia, as well as the role of women in governance and the conflict resolution in the Horn of Africa. Welcome to you, Ms. Abdul-Qadir.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. I'm just learning that that was Farah, right? Yeah. Mr. Osman, the Executive Director of Canadian Friends of Somalia, has had a situation on the way to getting here, so it's unclear to me that he's unlikely to be here to provide testimony. So we will ask him to possibly send us in some written briefing. And finally, we have Leticia Bader. Leticia Bader is a senior researcher in the African you're back. Okay, there you are. In the African Division of Human Rights Watch, focusing primarily on Somalia. She has investigated human rights abuses related to conflict, focusing in particular on abuses against children, internally displaced persons, and political detainees. Thank you all for making yourselves available to the subcommittee. I'm going to invite you to make your opening remarks, and I think we'll begin with Ms. Bader just because of the precariousness on occasion of the video connection, and we have you now, so we'll take advantage of that. Yeah, and then we'll proceed to Ms. Abdul-Qadir. So if you'd like to begin, thank you very much, Ms. Bader.
And I don't even have the excuse of being in Mogadishu at the moment. Honourable subcommittee members, thank you very much for inviting me to present on the current situation of human rights in Somalia. Membres du comité, merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité aujourd'hui. Je vais faire ma présentation.
Committee members, thank you very much for inviting me today. I will present in English, but I'll be delighted to take questions in French.
In Somalia, coupled with this new humanitarian crisis, continues to take a very heavy toll on civilians in Somalia. As we know, and as you have mentioned, in February, following a very protracted and quite controversial selection process, a new president came to power and also a new government came in. The new administration has definitely taken some important steps, notably, first and foremost, by making the humanitarian crisis a priority from the start, taking steps to clarify the structure of the security forces, and at the same time taking steps to establish a National Human Rights Commission. But political infighting, and in particular infighting with the new interim federal member states, has greatly delayed critical justice and security sector reforms. I'd like to focus my comments on a few areas. So first of all, ongoing attacks, including targeted attacks against civilians in the context of ongoing conflict, in the context of security operations against the armed Islamic group Al-Shabaab, abuses by Al-Shabaab, impunity for abuses by security forces and others on the ground, the situation of the internally displaced population, sexual violence and recruitment and use of children, including detention of children for security-related offences. To start off with, military operations in Somalia continue to have a devastating impact on civilians, resulting in deaths, injuries, and also massive displacement of the civilian population, as does a reigniting of a whole range of interclan conflict in many different parts of south-central Somalia. Security forces have continued to unlawfully kill and wound civilians, often during infighting between these forces over land, control over roadblocks, disarmament operation, but also during aid distributions. On June 9th, for example, 13 civilians were killed and 20 injured during a food distribution in Baidoa, which was very much one of the towns at the epicenter of the humanitarian crisis this year, when different regional forces started fighting amongst themselves. Civilians have also been targeted and also faced indiscriminate attacks in fighting over resources and political positions. Clan militia and regional forces. So, for example, in Lower Shabelle, very much a hotspot since 2013, in particular, of very long-term clan conflict and tensions. In the contested town of Galkayo, we have seen on several occasions in 2013, again last year, etc., fighting in between, at the border between these two parts of the Galkayo town. According to the UN as well, the African Union forces on the ground, as well as other foreign forces, have been responsible for significant number of civilian casualties during both ground operations but also airstrikes. I was just in Mogadishu interviewing survivors of a Kenyan airstrike which took place on September the 26th in the Gedo region. 4 camel herders were injured in that strike. They lost 20 camel in the strike. This is not the first. There have been many by the Kenyan forces which have wrongfully targeted civilians, killed livestock in an incredibly poor region. At the same time, in this context, we are seeing very limited accountability. In terms of what exists in terms of accountability structures, in Mogadishu, the government has relied very much on its National Intelligence Agency, which has no legal mandate to arrest or detain, to try and investigate a whole range of cases. And I continue to document very serious abuses by this intelligence agency, due process abuses, but also coerced confessions. Linked to this, the government continued to rely, both in South Central, but we've seen increasingly in Puntland as well, on military courts, which do not comply with international due process in terms of trials of individuals which are passing before these courts. And these courts have, since 2011, been trying almost all of the terrorism-related cases. As we know, these courts are also sentencing people to death following very questionable, controversial proceedings. At the same time, as in peacekeeping missions, the African Union forces on the ground basically rely on troop-contributing countries to hold their own troops to account. We have again and again over the years documented abuses by these African Union forces, but also very limited willingness on the part of troop-contributing countries to hold their forces to account. One relatively recent example, in 2016, the Ethiopian forces in the Bay region went into a village and killed 14 elders, devastated the village. At the African Union forces headquarters at the time said they would investigate. They did in fact send in a board of inquiry to investigate. The report was never made public and the community was never compensated. Obviously, one of the key perpetrators of abuses in the country continues to be Al-Shabaab, which continues to control large swathes of South Central Somalia. Al-Shabaab continue to commit very serious abuses in areas under their control, arbitrary executions. Just over the last week, we have again seen the execution of individuals who were accused of spying for foreign forces and for the government forces. It continues, as I will explain a bit more, to forcibly recruit adults, but also children, and to extort taxes on incredibly poor communities, including communities which have been most devastated by the drought, through threats. We've also seen how al-Shabaab has often played a very key role in clan conflict. And I think coming back once again to the lower Shabelle region, where you have very big animosities between the Haber-Gidir and the Biomal clan, al-Shabaab has shifted sides and hats over the years. And we have documented just this year how they were involved in attacks on a whole range of villages in lower Shabelle, targeted the Biomal community, abducting civilians, particularly elders, stealing livestock, and also committing arson. They literally devastated this tiny community, burning down villages. And I spoke to many of those at the time who were displaced, who fled to Mogadishu, and there were at least 15,000 people displaced just from those concentrated attacks in May. At the same time, we've definitely seen an increase in civilian casualties as a result of al-Shabaab claimed or attributed attacks by vehicle-borne improvised explosives devices in Mogadishu. I was in Mogadishu when the second bomb attack which you mentioned recently happened. I mean, obviously the October the 14th bomb is undescribable on many levels. You know, the junction where this attack happened is one where a whole range of individuals would go through. School buses were coming through. Internally displaced people would go to looking for menial tasks, daily tasks. So as you know, the figure at the moment is 358 killed. The reality is there's probably many more who we will never identify. Abuses against children, I mean, obviously key to the future of Somalia, but also time and again very much the first victims of the human rights and humanitarian crisis are children. We continue to see how armed groups kill and maim children and also target schools. In April, for example, on April the 18th, unidentified rebel groups fired mortars in the middle of the day in central Mogadishu. No one claimed responsibility for this attack, but it hit a school and a home, and it killed an 8-year-old girl and another civilian. I spoke to many of the children who were inside that school when the mortar hit. I mean, the trauma of the children, the fear of going back to school after such an attack. And so thinking obviously of long-term consequences on individuals who are going through this ongoing fear and trauma. At the same time, according to the UN, al-Shabaab has doubled recruitment of children since 2016. So I was in Baidoa 2 weeks ago, where I was speaking to communities who have been targeted by what is the most recent, since June this year, pressure on communities to hand over children to attend al-Shabaab-controlled Quranic schools, madrasas. So I was speaking to relatives, but also to children themselves who have been pushed towards government-controlled towns so that they would not be recruited by al-Shabaab. So they're dropping out of their schools, they're often being separated from their parents, and they're in towns where the humanitarian context is already pretty dire, and this is obviously not helping matters. But obviously abuses against children don't end for the children who have been recruited from al-Shabaab when they escape. I have spoken to many children who have been with al-Shabaab, who have escaped, but then have faced abuses at the hands of the government. The federal government has committed to rehabilitating children linked to al-Shabaab. And I would say on the one hand, we have seen some improvements in terms of handing over children to UNICEF and child protection actors. But our recent research shows very much how this is still very arbitrary, that many children spend prolonged time in intelligence detentions, face very abusive treatment inside, no access to their families, no access to lawyers. And some of those, a handful of those, are then handed over to the military courts and prosecuted. So we have documented a number of such cases in Mogadishu, also in Puntland. 11 children were sentenced to death in Puntland over the last year. Now their sentences were overturned, but they were still upheld very lengthy prison terms. So a real issue in terms of evidence of government commitment to treat children as what they are, first and foremost, as victims who require support and rehabilitation. Given the significant humanitarian support which Canada gives to Somalia, I would like to turn a bit to the humanitarian context and obviously in particular the situation of the displaced community. As I said, there has been massive displacement over the last year. According to the UN, we've seen about 900,000 new displacements. Obviously, a lot of that is linked to the drought, but in Somalia, drought, insecurity, conflict are often very, very closely linked. So at the moment, there is most likely to be a population of about 2.1 million people who are displaced, mainly into government-controlled towns, on the outskirts of towns, where humanitarian access in itself is very difficult. In terms of abuses, a whole range of indiscriminate violence, sexual violence, but also forced evictions, including by government forces. Over the first 4 or 5 months of this year, we saw again about 60,000 forced evictions of displaced communities, primarily in Mogadishu. What that means is that they're basically being pushed more and more on the outskirts of town to places where humanitarian access is very limited, but also where vulnerability and security is much higher. Important, I think, to underline also within this context is also the shrinking asylum space, I would say, for Somalis, notably in neighbouring Kenya. We've done a lot of research over the last year or so looking at the impact of the Kenyan government's decision to close what was the world's largest refugee camp, Dadaab. We investigated the UN allegedly voluntary returns program for Somalis at the time, and we came to the conclusion that given the push factors in Kenya, this could not be a voluntary return. And why?
Ms. Bader, if I can give you maybe just another 30 seconds or so to wrap up, I just want to make sure we've got time for questions, and I'm sure you're going to be able to come back to some of your additional content during the questions as well.
Brilliant. So why I raise this is obviously a lot of the returnees from Kenya are ending up in internally displaced camps. So maybe I will just end in terms of 3 recommendations. I mean, first of all, making sure that Canada, both in terms of its engagement with the Somali government, but obviously also with troop contributing countries and other foreign forces on the ground, really make clear that accountability, transparency, and building accountability mechanisms, whether it's within the African Union forces, within the Somali government forces, is key. Secondly, also in terms of humanitarian planning and programming, making sure that protection, including protection monitoring, which is all too often ignored in Somalia, but we have seen time and again results in new vulnerabilities to crisis, should be a priority. And finally, I think given the shrinking asylum space for Somalis in the region, I think making sure that Canada remains a haven for Somalis who continue to face persecution is absolutely essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll move to Ms. Abdul Kader, please.
Thank you. And let me also say thank you very much to the honorable members of this committee for inviting me to speak about this today. I'm glad that Letitia went first because there's much more detail and specificity to her talk. So I'm going to take you a little bit to kind of emphasize the context. I'm sure that the complexity of what is Somalia today and where we are is no secret, but I think it's really important to underscore some of the complexities. I'm interested, and I have been doing social justice research, and particularly looking at what could be a viable transitional justice mechanism for Somalia. So we have, with other researchers, published in that area to try and see how Somalis and Somalia can kind of heal from what went down. So as you all know, Somalia has been declared a failed state for more than 2 decades. Now that it has a government, it's still a very fragile government. So since the 1990s, the failed state has resulted in human rights abuses, conflict. The country is really fragmented politically and socially. War has been waged along clan lines. Entire communities were implicated. Not that necessarily they all participated, but few armed militia teams used and mobilized people along clan lines. So there's large communal violences and people whom their grievances have not been really dealt with. There are numerous studies that talk about and highlight the need for sort of a transitional justice and ways to address these pervasive systemic human rights violations that have been taking place in Somalia, and Human Rights Watch is one of them. Amnesty has written about it. All kinds of research is out there. And it should be noted that human rights violations in Somalia do predate the civil war. The country has been under a military dictatorship for 21 years prior to, between 1969 to 1990. Under a military dictatorship. So when you really think about this complexity, which is why I want to kind of underline it, there's a historian, Charles Geschecter, who wrote early in the 90s, in 1993, and I quote, says that the disintegration of Somalia raised policy questions about the culture of power in the modern state, the definition of good governance, the principle of national sovereignty, and the concept of humanitarian intervention. So the complexity around that context is really, it kind of brings not only human rights, but the humanitarian stuff that have followed. So the Somali state processes and the lack of justice institutions, the lack of accountability, as the previous speaker highlighted, and the impunity of people who are misusing the power that they have, and the display of absolutely disregarding respect for human life and people's properties, raise all kinds of challenges. So those challenges are compounded by the limitations and the total collapse of all state institutions. Human rights abuses. The complexity of Somalia is human rights abuses that started with the military regime, then went to the militias, then went to the clan warlords, have been now, we have witnessed foreigners in the sense that non-Somali actors are now committing human rights abuses in Somalia, whether it's frontline states who come into the border and do whatever they want at the border, whether it's the African Union mission soldiers who, just as any peacekeeping groups, are also committing human rights abuses and civilian casualties, whether it is coercing children, because when you think about the last 27 years, there was no other sector other than the so-called security or armed teams hiring kids, coercing them to become somebody's security guard or somebody's soldier or somebody's foot soldier for that matter. So we have got an entire 2, if not 3 generations of children that have grown up, have been recruited, have become killing machines for people. The latest, I think, I remember I did go to Somalia for about 8 months in 2016 to lead a team of researchers to support the UNSOM and the AMISOM mission in Mogadishu. And when Al-Shabaab attacked Puntland, there were a large number of kids that were captured as Al-Shabaab soldiers who just surrendered because they were so scared. They were put in boats from Central and taken to Puntland. And I know that UNICEF and everybody was trying to talk to the Puntland government to not kind of persecute these kids and to, put them through military court processes. But then again, there are no really viable institutions too. So I would say that human rights abuses when it comes to child soldiers or recruiting kids, and when you think about the context of abject poverty and lawlessness, that becomes the only avenue that kids, get hired because they're free to be coerced. The challenges that have been brought on by the civil war and the large communal scales, and sort of when you talk to Somalis about this, there's like layers, and the layers are, some are stuck in saying, you know what, my properties in the capital city are still under people who took it. So there is no acknowledgement. So these are like open wounds that when you talk to Somalis, these are not something that they have moved on and have resolved it and dealt with it. So the gaping hole that we see is there hasn't been any attempt to properly reconcile people and communities. I think the examples that Letitia talked about in Lower Shabelle, in Marka, what we have seen is warlords that have been pillaging these communities are now called national security personnel, and they are, because of the whole clan dynamics now, they are now wearing the national military uniforms. But when you talk to the local communities, they'll tell you, I know so-and-so. So-and-so was here in the late 90s and the 2000s as a warlord, and now he's supposedly government. So there is a very complex, layered issues that need to be sorted out. And as much as the African Union mission and the UN and everybody is trying to, the international community, sort of build these institutions, there needs to be a space for these sociopolitical conflict processes to really come up with an organic way for these communities to come together and acknowledge. So those challenges are really, in the case of any civil war, and the casualties of the Somali civil war are complex. But I think they are particularly in the context of Somalia complex because the political reconciliations are not deep enough. You need reconciliation at a very low level, communal neighborhood levels. You need it at a regional level, and you need it at a national level. So when I see the international community, and particularly places like, countries like Canada, I think that is what is lacking. There is military presence all around. There is the African Union mission, there are the drones. Everybody is trying to kind of contain these terror groups inside Somalia, but the socio-political processes seem to be then left out. And that is where I see that these things can be really reined in, and these governance institutions can be then deepened, because right now they are somewhat superficial in positions. So you've got clans still taking revenge on each other. You've got people who are continuously internally displaced, and the internally displaced communities are the most vulnerable after the children, because they are sort of pushed out of the places that they were either farming or had their livestock, and are brought into some urban centers, and then are in this gated, internally displaced camps that they don't have freedom to go anywhere. And when you even talk to aid organizations, for them to reach those, they have to deal with what they're naming gatekeepers. So there are people who are actually benefiting from keeping these people in this internally displaced. And these internally displaced communities are disproportionately women and children. And they are vulnerable to sexual violence by everybody. So Somali community are divided along clan lines, and of course in every society there are minorities and major so-called clans. So those people who are displaced and might be from a minority clan, or might be displaced in a town where they are not from and they have fled another part of the country, are really the most vulnerable groups. And rape is rampant, not only by Somali soldiers, but by everybody. So we need to address that as well, because there is sexual violence happening. And I know that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, everybody wrote about it, but civilians, internally displaced, children internally displaced, and then civilians endure the most abuses as well. So the warring parties create these humanitarian conditions that continue to really devastate people. The government, as fragile as it is, tries to commit something, but sometimes you will hear their own security forces who are not being paid regularly are pillaging people and doing. And remember talking to some of the AMISOM troops who are carrying out some missions and want to work with the Somali National Army, and they would leave the Somali National Army in a village that they have just liberated, but then those very people are going to create roadblocks and start extorting people. So the communities sometimes would say, you know what? When the Al-Shabaab team was here, we were only paying one person. Now we've got multiple roadblocks and multiple sort of people wanting us to pay. So that is another, the lack of capacity of the government to actually hold on to these territories and then provide security to the people. Targeted killing. there is absolutely a style of targeted killing of people who might be from the diaspora, who might be political leaders, who might be active human rights defenders are targeted on a daily basis and they are killed. The extremist groups target them, the warlords target them, the militias, and whomever is benefiting. Because when you think about almost 30 years of lawlessness, and it's not going to be a vacuum. So there is a war of economy, and there is those who benefit and profiteer from that war economy, and they settle scores and do commit human rights abuses. The other group that really have borne the brunt of it are journalists and the media. Media is continuously targeted and killed. Large numbers of journalists, I don't have the statistics with me today, but every single year there are large numbers of journalists who are killed and media houses attacked.
Ms. Abdulkader, if I can maybe get you to wrap up
Sure.
in the next minute, and just so that we leave time to at least get questions from all the groups at the table.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, one other thing I just want to highlight is the convoluted processes that are supposedly to be the justice frameworks that are at play and operationalized in Somalia. The complexity around when there was total collapse of the state, you've got now Sharia frameworks being operationalized, you've got the Somali indigenous customary law, which is known as HER, is also operationalized, and government civil and criminal laws. So you've got 3, if not more, justice frameworks being operationalized, and people do have the option to actually say to the government, since their institutions are not that strong, we will settle our cases with the elders and the customary law, or we would opt for Sharia. So that then brings who has access to these things. And that leaves us, I think, women and children most of the time, because business people and warlords control these arenas, whether it's the Sharia arena, whether it's the clan elder arena, whether it's government. So people are really left, especially women, with lack of access to justice. And I'm just going to stop there.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for your testimony. We'll move right into questions, and we're going to begin with MP Sweet.
Thank you very much, Chair. I appreciate that, and I very much appreciate our witnesses' testimony. However dark it may be, certainly is not their issue. This is certainly one of the worst situations that we've heard about in this committee in this session of Parliament. We had 2 witnesses yesterday, Ian Spears and Ken Menkhouse, and they made some observations. I might want to just confirm some of their observations with you so that we have it on the record for our report. But you've mentioned now with Al-Shabaab shaking down and killing people, the clan violence between each other, the security forces killing civilians. There must be a diminishment, to make things worse, a diminishment of NGOs who would have the capacity to be there and keep themselves safe. And so can you let us know, is there a significant amount of NGOs that have left the area who would normally service these displaced people because of the security situation? Mrs. Bader.
So, I mean, obviously, I am not a humanitarian expert, but I mean, this is definitely something we've looked into. I mean, I would say, I'm not sure if there's been a diminished space. I think compared to, I was doing research in 2011, I mean, looking at all the gatekeepers communities in Mogadishu at the time. And I mean, I would say the difference is, you do have a few more spots closer to the epicenter. So Baidoa town, for example, which in 2011 IDPs could not go to, have opened up. So it means that in some ways humanitarian actors have somewhat closer access to some of the communities most at need, but that access is incredibly limited. In Mogadishu, I mean, a lot of the humanitarian, I would say international humanitarian organizations don't go past kilometer 13, so they're not going further out of town. What we've seen over the last 6 months is also in local NGOs. So just 2 weeks ago around Baidoa, it's happened around Beledweyne, local NGO staff going out into slightly more al-Shabaab controlled areas and basically being abducted for ransom. All of them have been released, but after quite significant negotiations, etc. I mean, from the Shabaab narrative, I think it's quite often wanting individuals to deal in their communities on their terms, but you know, from a point of view of access, it obviously limits things significantly. We've also seen a lot of targeted attacks on humanitarian actors over the last year, so it remains incredibly difficult. It means that there is limited monitoring of what is going on, and I think, you know, at the end of the day, this then has very significant impacts also on those most in need in terms of making sure that those who really are in need are getting the assistance. And this comes back to the comment Fauzia was making again about these gatekeepers who run very much the show around internally displaced settlements, especially in Mogadishu, where there's a very entrenched system, because there's no one else. The government does not manage any of these IDP settlements. It is these private individuals, generally linked to local clan militia, who are the ones controlling entrance, access, etc., to these facilities, and who often determine which IDPs get access to assistance as well. So it's still a very difficult context.
Ms. Abdulkader, is there a role in the child soldier concern where instead of apprehending them and getting them to a facility where they can begin to for lack of better words, deprogram them and bring them back into a cultural sensitivity where they can go back in their community. Is there a role to play for the United Nations here to bring an amalgam of countries that have already had to deal with this and negotiate with Somalia rather than incarcerating them, to hand them over and to, you know, a safe facility where they could be rehabilitated?
Sure, absolutely. There is a role, and there is a small-scale attempt on that. There is a center in Baydhabo. Baydhabo is a southern city. There's a center that the UN's DDR, I think Demobilization, Disarmament, and Reintegration Program, have built a center where they're trying to, you know, there are kids who might have joined Al-Shabaab and then got disillusioned and then came back. So there is a training center. It's really limited. When I was there, they had about 16 kids, but there is a process where the UNSOM, the UN mission in Somalia, is trying to sort of create all these communication strategies where they're trying to reduce the number of kids who actually get attracted to Al-Shabaab, and they're consulting the community on that. I know that there was an attempt to open another center in Kismayo, which is another port city in the south, and I think they started building it. I don't know if it's open yet. So there are, UNICEF and the UN are trying, but absolutely there's a need to support that and to broaden it. Not too many people can travel by road in the country, but now that there are federal member states, and these federal member states have interim capital cities, there are several sort of centers now that can be utilized. It's not, even though everything is in Mogadishu. Now there is, with the federalism process being sort of implemented, there is an opportunity to sort of maybe establish several centers in these various regions. And yeah, there is a role for the international community and the UN to build that better.
Chair, for our recommendations, could I ask that the researchers maybe get a report regarding the DDR to see if it's one of the UN projects that's underfunded, and what we might be able to suggest in that when it comes down to completion of the study?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're now going to move. Oh. So,
yes, I mean, maybe if I just come in on that question, because I actually have a report coming out just on this very issue in hopefully 2 months.
If I can, Ms. Bader, if I can get you to give a very short answer then, because we want to be able to have the other members have time to ask a question, and the clock is ticking, so a quick response for sure.
So the very short answer is that there needs to be much more oversight over this process, which is happening at the moment, because the children who do end up in these centres, there are a number of them now, it's often dependent on their clan and their economic status, whether they end up in those centres or whether they end up in prison. So I think one of the big concerns we have at the moment is that there is no oversight over the intelligence screening of children. And so this leaves a lot of arbitrariness in the process. So I think also at the political level, that's where the push needs to be as well.
Thank you. MP Tabera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for both witnesses for being here and giving your insights on the situation and the ongoing crisis in Somalia. We had witnesses that came yesterday, Mankaus and Mr. Spears, Mr. Mankaus and Mr. Spears, and they elaborated on weak national state structures. And as we can see during independence in 1960, those structures, those state structures weren't very solid and they were very weak. And in terms of that, there was anarchy during the Civil War and the government fell at the time, and we see a failed state. My question is how do we ensure that we strengthen these state structures? Al-Shabaab is controlling large quarters in Somalia. They've been able to recruit a lot of young adults. Ms. Abdelkader, you mentioned that the recruitment has doubled since 2016. The African Union, I think, has been ineffective in some ways, and the government of Somalia have been ineffective to ensure that Al-Shabaab doesn't control large quarters of Somalia. So my question is how can we strengthen these state structures, whether, and I'll begin with Ms. Abdelkader, you mentioned local structures, regional structures, and even at the national level. So if you can elaborate.
Sure. I think that is the several million-dollar question, which is how do you rebuild the state apparatus and the state institutions and the state? What is fragmented, and you know, you rightly saw, post-independence states in many parts of Africa, and particularly in Somalia, were not viable enough to have kind of catered to the needs of the people. So they really were limited to cities, to capital cities. So we witnessed and have seen and lived through a one-state city where everything was in Mogadishu that you didn't have the rest of the country. And for its fall, the fall of Mogadishu was the fall of the entire government then. So now that coupled with people have been mobilized through political identity. So communities were not at war before then, but now people don't feel safe to go to certain parts of the country. Everybody retreated to their region. So the federal system is sort of like a compromise to sort of kind of decenter that one city state. So how do you go about, I think, contextualizing it and creating, I think the intervention from the 90s was heavily on the military side. So there was a lot of military intervention. There are periods where the international community didn't even do anything and Somalis were left to their own devices. And I see that with the African Union mission now, you've got the military, you've got more than 24-some thousand African troops from various countries on the ground, plus whatever national security people that are there, yet they can't seem to beat these groups that are not even 10,000, they're like 5,000 or something. And I think what is missing, and I think the crux of it will be to try and deepen these governance structures and take the governance structures and build trust with the communities at the local level, while you are simultaneously trying to also reconcile and address grievances. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think what I see the gap is as you have these military and humanitarian interventions, there needs to be some political and social reconciliation, comprehensive at every level, so that people are now beginning to have conferences inside the country. For the longest time, conferences were happening in Nairobi and Kampala for even the politicians to talk to each other. Now that we have federal member states and their cities, there actually politicians can go and meet inside the country, in not only in Mogadishu but in different parts. I think it's the beginning of something good, decentralizing the power and taking it away from just one city. Now we need to kind of then couple the military interventions and the security apparatus with some sort of a social and political reconciliation and conflict resolution processes that are informed by the indigenous sort of mechanisms as well. I hope that kind of covers. So,
no, thank you very much. And my second question will be, for the Canadian Somali community that's been affected by the Mogadishu attacks, what can you elaborate on maybe what the Somali community here in Canada can do to maybe mobilize and maybe somehow assist in helping some of their extended family members that are in crisis in the situation in Somalia?
Thank you for that question. I think diaspora, particularly the Canadian diaspora, has been really connected to the country and helping, and I know that you all hear about the remittances. Somalia, without a state for the last 30 years, survived mainly because the diaspora people have been sending money back. The Canadian diaspora was particularly active, and we've got federal member parliaments at the Somali level, at the national level, at the regions. There are many Somali Canadians who went back. I think the killings of the extremists have been ongoing, and the casualty were always Somali civilians. But the October 14th one, we're hoping that had some sort of a silver lining in that people are coming together. Somalis are galvanized to stand together against these atrocious killings. So now there is a momentum building up, and people are saying we need to kind of hold the politicians accountable. We need to come together. There has been mass rallies inside the country and also outside. There were fundraising that occurred here. We have had several. We had a vigil here at Parliament. So the community is coming together and saying enough is enough. Can we now be a little bit more effective in how we put pressure on those who are leading the country and demand better accountability, better sort of human rights issues.
Thank you very much.
So there is a role for the Canadian diaspora for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll move to MP Hardcastle.
Thanks very much, Chair. I want to thank our guests for some very thought-provoking information. And I guess I'd like to start off with Ms. Bader. I'd like to hear you continue a little bit more about the issue of rehabilitating our child soldiers. And you mentioned to my colleague that you do have a report coming out. Do we have some concrete recommendations that we should be focusing on as we go through this study? And then my other question would be in a general nature to the both of you. We heard from previous witnesses that part of the issue with impunity, besides a structure where we need access to justice, so maybe you can talk about how we can contribute to that, but apparently one of the low-hanging fruits, if you will, would be if we were to address the dual citizenship. There's people that hold citizenship in different countries as well as Somalia, and there may be an opportunity there. So that's all I'm going to ask, and the two of you can share that time as long as our chairperson allows. Appreciate that. Thanks.
Okay, I'll quickly go first on the first question. I mean, I think one of the problems at the moment is both, I would say, a kind of concerted lack of political will to treat all children equally in this context. But I think it's also, I mean, some very concrete recommendations is, as I mentioned before, oversight over intelligence detention facilities. There is obviously a lot of international support going to the intelligence, both in Mogadishu and in Puntland. making sure that there is oversight over the screening process and over interrogations is essential, and calling for basic due process. When children are picked up in mass sweeps, because in Mogadishu the majority of children are actually not picked up off the battlefield, they're picked up in very regular mass sweeps in the town, their parents don't find out often for weeks where they are. So oversight, due process within the intelligence system. Very concrete call is to make sure that no cases of children are heard before military courts. So the cases which Fauzia was mentioning about Puntland last year, the Puntland courts basically tried over, in the end it was about 40 plus children in military court trials, which left much to be desired. Those children have been handed over to rehabilitation, but actually the court sentences have not been overturned. So I think another whole area of recommendations is the international community is supporting DDR programming. They're supporting to a certain extent some activities around former combatants, but there are real grey zones around what are these former combatants programming legally. Are these alternatives to prison sentences? Does a child, once they turn 18, have to go back to prison to serve out? There's massive grey zone, which leads real risks of prolonged detention of children. And I'll let Fauzia respond more on the whole question of access to justice. I mean, maybe coming to the initial point Fauzia was making about the need for really starting to think about transitional justice. I think now is the right time. As we speak, the Security Council Somalia-Eritrea monitoring report, which came out today, has been discussed at the Security Council, and one of their recommendations, which is one we've supported for years, is for there to be a mapping report on Somalia, which would look at the gravest abuses over time, and that the team of experts who would work on this mapping report would basically come up with some very concrete recommendations. I think this is something it would be useful for Canada to support. I think it would be useful for them to call on the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, as they have done so in Congo. They're also doing in CAR at the moment. I think it's now time for Somalia to actually have some sort of record that can then feed into transitional justice, can feed into vetting of worst abusers, whether it's in the civilian side or on the military side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Quickly, with regards to the child soldier thing and the rehabilitation, when I was there, the African Union Mission commissioned the research. I'll try and dig that up for you guys, where they actually spoke to the kids who came back and tried to come up with some recommendations and communication strategies. They spoke to the Baydava Center, the kids who were there. So I'll try and communicate that back to the clerk. In terms of the impunity, I think transitional justice and reconciliation are really where efforts need to be put in. And as a Canadian Somali, I think there is a great deal a role that Canada can play in that sense. And starting with that whole mapping research that which was just mentioned. But in terms of also people who have dual citizenships and are there and might be implicated in some of the atrocities themselves, I know that people are talking about how to engage, and the Center for Justice in the U.S. have been approached by a couple of people that I know from UK and whatnot, trying to sort of say, these leaders who are there now, and stuff is happening, and they could be implicated in what is happening. Is there a recourse that we can maybe hold them accountable through their dual citizenship? So it's a kind of slippery slope, but I think there needs to be some sort of international pressure on some of these leaders, because, as things go bad, they can just leave with their European and North American passports, but they might have been, part to some human rights abuses. And I really think peace building, conflict resolution, and transitional justice is where it's at now, because 20-some years of trying to do military intervention hasn't really led to any stable governance structures. And maybe this is the time to create those dialogues. And Somalia's constitution is calling for Human Rights Commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and none of those commissions, since 2012, it was supposed to have been the first 100 days of that government to have established that. They have not moved on that. They're still trying to debate the draft constitution. So there is a role that Canada can play in terms of providing support for those processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that was literally on 7 minutes. Thank you. I want to thank both of our witnesses for your testimony before us today.
Very small, very small.
Who's up? Ikra's up. Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate both of you for your testimony. I would like to know, actually, like I had a bit of a preamble with respect to Somalis now leaving Kenya, coming back to Somalia, and the human rights atrocities, the clan wars, and the dual citizenry, the lack of governance basically in that region, but also the high level of economy and then the development of trade in the region. My question to both of you, if you can please answer briefly, is what concrete role can Canada play in helping the situation in for Somalia to come up and get out of the situation that it's in now? Please, thank you.
Quickly, I think there is a role for sure. The refugees who are coming back to basically nothing. There could be a small city in the south or two where they can get brought to, and I don't know what the longer-term plan is. I know that the UNHCR has an envoy for Somalia, and they're kind of talking to donors to try and create communities for these people to settle in. So there is a role for Canada if that can really be mapped out. And there is a whole UNHCR, Kenya, Somalia agreement that can be looked at. And I know that the Canadian ambassador in Nairobi is also keen on finding out more. I would say that between the Canadian Somali diaspora and this committee and members of parliament, we can look into that further and come out with some niches that Canada can support for sure.
Thank you very much. With that, I am going to again thank the witnesses for their testimony here this afternoon. We had back-to-back days focusing on this issue, and we heard a lot of very important testimony that I think has been greatly enlightening to the members of this committee. And with that, I just want to ask the members if we have approval to put out the press release. Good? Okay. Thank you. So with that, we shall adjourn. Thank you.